Hello, and welcome to Floating City Game Development Part 2. Name very much pending. Don't know if this will be the final name. Hopefully you guys can come up with something. If not, then I'll come up with something later on. But this time we're going to be talking about sort of the core of the game. And what we want to do when creating the core of the game is mainly to expand our design space so that we can create a really interesting game without making it too complicated. Ideally, you have complex interactions, but not complicated rule sets. The simpler the game, usually the better, especially when you're able to get lots of complex interactions between the different things. So that's what we're going to be doing in this episode, is we're going to try and create the core of the game. Now, so far I've done about half of the core, and again, it's based off of these inspirations that I covered last time. But you'll sort of see my thought process and iterations to get to the point where I am. And eventually I'll go ahead and move on and create the entire core of the game and eventually the entire game itself. Now, this would also be a good point to where if you want to point the way of this project, point it in a specific direction, this would be a great point to chime in and try and put your own take on the entire game, if you would like, of course. Now, one thing I'd like to cover, which I'll sort of steal from Tempo's team. Tempo created this really cool game called The Bazaar, and a part of it, they sort of explained how design space works, and I thought it was a really good explanation, so I'm just going to go ahead and explain it here as well. Essentially, the way that it boils down to is how many mechanics does a player have to learn and how much complexity can they get from it. So, of course, the more mechanics they learn, the more complicated it is, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Obviously, you want your games to be complex and in-depth, but you don't necessarily want it to be hard to learn or teach, for that matter. So, a really good example of this would be, let's say there are 100 different mechanics and one way to use them. So you can imagine this as you have a card and you can play a card on your turn, and there are 100 different cards. Now, that's 100 different cards you have to learn, but they all interact in their own unique ways, right? It can also be described as like 100 different debuffs, like slow, freeze, burn, poison, 100 different things that the player has to learn before they can use them in one way. So in total, this gives you a design space of 100 per se, and the player has to learn 101 mechanics, 100 for each of the debuffs or cards, and 1 for the how you play it, right? Now let's look at a much simpler version, 10 by 10. So let's say you have 10 debuffs and you have 10 ways, 10 different card types or something to that effect. Well, you'll still have that 100 design space, but your player only has to learn 20 different mechanics. That's, again, just because there's less mechanics to learn, but there are a lot of more different ways for you to combine them together. Okay, maybe you can have a burn effect on a minion card and then a poison effect on a spell card, but then you can also have a burn effect on a spell card and a poison effect on a minion card. So you can really mix things up with those things. So essentially it gives you the same gameplay complexity, and the same design freedom, as I wrote here actually. It's just less confusing. There's less things to learn. As you can see, there's an 81 mechanic difference. Now, another thing to consider would be, okay, let's say you have 100 mechanics, 100 different debuffs, and 10 different card types. Well, you have 1,000 design space, 1,000 different ways you can do things, but your player has to learn 110 mechanics. Now, if you were to instead add a new dimension, 10 times 10 times 10, you would still have that same design space of 1,000, tons of things you can do with that, tons of things your players can do with that, but they only have to learn 30 things, which is a significant improvement for such a big jump in complexity. So adding more dimensions usually makes it more interesting and more complex. So what we're trying to do is maximize our design space while minimizing the complexity. And trying to make it so it's not so convoluted. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do with these iterations. So I'm going to first and foremost just go through the main sort of first steps that I'm doing here, and eventually will lead up to what I actually finally came up with. And again, it won't be the full game, but perhaps in the next video we'll talk about the entire core of the game versus as of right now it's only maybe again a quarter or halfway done. So first and foremost, I know what I want my goals to be. In this game, I want you to try and build up this city, and perhaps even like, because this game doesn't really have a name right now, perhaps the goal of the game is you get to actually name the floating city if you have the most wealth, the most power, or are the most influential. And I even have 3 little sub goals that could be potentially useful for these goals. And perhaps I'm sort of thinking about it now. Maybe we'll have a victory point system where at the very end of the game, you have to have the most soldiers, or you have to have this or that or this. And at the very end of the game, you're awarded victory points. You're not gaining it through the entire thing. The whole game is at its end, and there's just 9 sort of like bonus stars that get split among people, except there's only those stars, right? So whoever has the most in each of these categories would, in theory, win the game. But for now, I don't know if that goal is super cemented, but that's sort of the idea, the rough idea, very rough idea. So first and foremost, for this first iteration, I thought, okay, usually the way I start things is I make rounds. Rounds are a super easy way to compartmentalize each of these different mechanics, each of these different sections. I shifted away from this very quickly, but it's a really good place to start if you want to try creating your own game. So first and foremost, I wanted players to be able to create community projects. So that's the first thing each of the players would do in a round, is all of the players would select a project, whether it be in their hand or on the board somewhere publicly. I don't know. Just somehow they select the project to start, they place it openly, and they contribute 1 worker to it. And essentially what this does is it just makes it open to everyone. So now you have project and people can work on it. Now, the second thing each person does in a round is they would contribute 3 workers in a snake draft order. So essentially what this means is each person would contribute at the start of the round. They would contribute 1 project, right? And each person would do this. Let's say there's 3 people, 3 different projects. Now each one is given a worker, because in order to start a project, you need to contribute a worker. Then each person in snake draft order will contribute 3 of their workers to each of these projects. Now what snake draft order is it's sort of like this, a little bit like a snake. So we'll start with the first player. They get to contribute 3 of their workers. This player can do the same, and then this player can do the same, and then it snakes around where this one gets its second turn, sort of compensation for being last, and then they get a second turn, and because they went first, they have the last pick. Essentially is the reason why snake drafts are pretty nice, pretty fair, I would say, but we'll see if that actually makes it to the end. Spoiler, I don't think it does. So the next thing that players would do in the round is they would work, or the community would work on community projects. So it's less what the players would do, but more of sort of a passive timer. So each of these projects would have a time, or like a worker limit. So the worker limit would be like 5, 6, 7, something like that. And if they weren't maxed out, then more workers would go in. Maybe like 1 worker for this one plus 1, 1 extra worker for this one plus 2. And if it wasn't filled up, then it would just gain more workers. And once a project is filled up, then boom, the project is done. And that's actually step 4 here, is the projects are completed. Any projects that have all of its workers met will be completed, and based on how much you contributed, you'll gain some sort of resource. So the different types of contributions I have here are the top contributor bonus, So there's some sort of reward for you contributing the most to a project. And in order to help incentivize you wanting to contribute more, there's also a per worker. So if you contribute 3 workers, then you're going to get like 3 gold out of it. And if you're the one who contributed the most, you might get a little bit more gold. If you have any contribution, ideally this is, again, one of the core mechanics is, or one of the core things I want to bring up is that everyone gets something out of any sort of action. So even if you only contribute like 1 worker, then you'll get something out of it. And that's a really powerful incentive to sort of dig in everyone else's pie and pay attention to what they're doing. And I also have a no contribution like penalty. But I'd rather you choose to do something rather than penalize not doing something. It's sort of a weird thing, but it feels terrible to lose something, but it's great to gain something. Well, it's not great to gain something. It feels good to gain something, but it feels terrible to lose something. So that's generally why I sort of want to shift away from that. So this is my first draft. It's very unfinished because I immediately shifted away from it. I do not like this rigid round structure where players have to do this, do this, do this, do this. I think it adds a lot more design space, a lot more complexity when players are able to choose what actions they want to do rather than it be predetermined in this set order. So that way they can value which action would be best in this moment versus, it's that time of the round, right? So shifting sort of away from this, we have now the second draft. As you can see, rounds is a lot smaller now. Still only like 3, or before it was 4, but again, I stopped pretty early with that. So this time around, players will first and foremost take their actions. Then the community will still work on community projects. The reason why I sort of wanted to keep this was just because I think it would make the world feel a lot more alive. It would feel like you're not the ones like forcing things to happen, even though you kind of are. Like the community is still a part of this floating city. You aren't alone on it. Then I decided to implement a chapter system. So you would have to go through several different rounds where you would be doing stuff. It puts a little bit of a time limit on the game. One issue I have with some games, like for example, Unstable Unicorns, there's no hard limit on how long a game will go. They really fixed it in their next game though, Unstable Games. They came up with Here to Slay because there is a hard limit on that with the monsters slain. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. But essentially there's permanent progression. And this way the game will guaranteed end at some point, which is very important because if there's no guarantee for it to end, then it might go on forever, which is a big uh-oh. That's what it's called professionally, trust me. So for our different actions that you would do, again, each player would take 1 action in this round structure. Is you can either start a community project, works the same way. You just place a community project and you put in a worker and contribute to it. Now, a little bit of a small change here. I do want there to be a board. I want this to feel like you're building up a city. So there will be a hex grid because I think it would be really interesting to have adjacency bonuses in 6 different directions. I think it could add a lot of complexity. Originally, I kind of wanted it to be, I think it's an octagon is the correct shape because then you can have it adjacent to other octagons. I can draw better than that, trust me. But you can also have squares in between the octagons. I think that's the correct shape. But I think this would be super interesting because you would have one type of tile that's like purely contribution or purely like bonus to adjacent tiles, and then each of the tiles would have their own sort of thing. I think this would be really interesting, but purely from a cost perspective, producing something with octagons and squares, it may seem like it's kind of stupid, but it is very like a genuine concern how expensive this might be when compared to hexes, which are pretty standard. in production. So yeah, unfortunately, this I don't think is going to ever happen. But hex workers, or sorry, hex places on the grid. So each community project will have, or most community projects will have you placing construction tokens on these different tiles. So you might have construction token A and construction token A, and like two of them. Then you would put the A token on top of the community project you want to do, and then you'd place the other A token onto the actual grid, and that's where it'll actually be built up. So that's sort of my idea there for that. You still can, as an action, contribute up to 3 workers to a community project. And again, the same limitations as before. Small change is, instead of having a no contribution bonus, again, I don't really think that's a good thing to have, and also a per worker bonus, I also don't think that's a good thing to have, because ideally you want to just incentivize contributing as much as possible without actually making it like, how do I say this? Ideally, you want there to be competition for who gets the top bid. And if you have even like a single contribution to it, you can just leave it there. And ideally, everyone, ideally, there are situations where people might just put in 1 because they don't want the top contributor bonus. And then if everyone contributes 1, and let's say the worker limit is 5, right? Then a really interesting scenario happens where no one really wants to be the last one to contribute, and like you're sort of doing a service to everyone by doing it, which is eventually why I think I removed this, or eventually will remove that, is purely because this is a really funny mechanic. Or something like this, even 6, let's say some player has 2. Well, it's, man, how do I say this? But it's really a funny scenario, because whoever contributes last and contributes to finish the final thing is like, yay, it's done. But like, you could have done your action on something else. That's also another reason why it's specifically 3, is because you might want to just spread out and contribute to multiple different things, because you're going to get that any contribution bonus. But none of the projects are going to be finished unless you try and get a little bit extra. So I think that's really funny, and I really want to keep that. I'm sort of debating if I even want the top contributor bonus, because of how funny it would be if people are forcing each other, like, come on, I'll give you 2 workers if you contribute some to here, so this project finally finishes, like, that's just a hilarious scenario to me. So, even this is sort of like iffy, but anyways, this is how it is currently. Another one is I started to try and implement the gang system, which I'll end up changing quite a bit, but essentially you'll just be able to move your little gangs around the board in this case. And in this case, you'll also be able to gain control of certain tokens or of certain tiles. So these certain constructions, like if you build a shop, if you build a restaurant, or if you build like a mine or something, if you have your gang on it, then you're able to claim control over it, and you'll be able to get the resources from it. And then constructions, some of them can be upgraded, is sort of the key point there. So maybe you start with a restaurant, and then you upgrade it to a hotel or something like that. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's sort of the progression I'm thinking of here. So up for our next iteration, now we introduced the setup. I know it's a little bit late, but right now I'm going to have it as each player gets 5 random community projects to their hand. So we're going to treat this as sort of a total brain fart. We're going to try to sort of treat these community projects, oh my god, these community projects as cards in your hand. Other people don't know what you have, so you can sort of plan in the future for what will be available at what time. Again, each of these projects will give you some resources or some upgrades to buildings on the field and things like that. So you're able to plan ahead. There's some hidden information there, and you're able to sort of plan ahead. And keep repeating myself, but yeah, the nice thing about hands of cards is you're able to plan ahead without your opponents knowing what you're actually planning for, which is really cool. I also have it so that the remaining community projects form a deck. And in this case, instead of having, as before, like a hard act limit or a chapter limit, instead it naturally progresses where essentially each portion of the deck acts as its own act. Like by the end of every 15 cards, plus some events. So, okay, let me explain events really quickly. So events are just special effects that happen when drawn. The idea with this different card back is just so that if there's an event incoming, you have some sort of knowledge. You know that it's coming, and it's just going to be a special effect that happens when it's drawn, and then it just goes away. And you'll have these 3 random events. They happen, they disappear. 15 community projects in each part, and those will just go into players' hands. And then the last card here is Landfall. These are like special events. These will signify huge portions of the game. This is where you make landfall and you trade with denizens of the land, not the sky, which is where we are. You remember we're in the sky? We're in the sky, floating city game. Anyways, that's sort of where we're at here. Is I want landfalls to be sort of breaks between the acts, sort of different chapters of each story, different turning points. These should be points where you can gain really large benefits and can really swing the game. These can really help you gain favor compared to other players who might be ahead. This is where you might strategize a lot more. But anyways, that's pretty much what we're doing with these. I've also been thinking about, okay, maybe there are different achievements. So again, kind of going back to this like bonus stars idea where you have your different goals, and then maybe there are also sub goals you try and work towards. And the idea with these landfall achievements is specifically, I want it to be clear which achievements you're going for between each landfall. So, for example, at the start of each act, there might be 3 different goals here. And by the end of the act, when the landfall happens, if you did the best at these sub goals, you will gain some extra points. And these sub goals should align with these final goals, so they should push players in the right direction while still giving like sort of like progress updates on what you're doing. And it should also incentivize a lot of competition between the players because they're going for these points instead of, I mean, they still should be diversifying in order to get these, each of these 9 different points at the end of the game, but there's still going to be competition. There's not like someone that's going to go all on wealth, one person's all on power, one person's on influential. No, in this case, there's going to be competition for these 3 points and a little bit of build up for the other things. So that's a lot of different cool ideas that you can do with landfalls with these different splits and chapters. So that's sort of the idea behind them. Actions, I just relisted some of the ones that I put in. There's a slight difference in community projects where you draw a new card. That's right. Sorry about that. Having a hard time seeing this. For some reason, my printer won't print black anymore, so just green. Anyways, so with this, you draw a new card, you refresh. This is how you get through your different projects. Yeah. So as for combat, both players will now secretly choose a weapon card, and based on that value and the combat value, the winner will be decided. So for example, if you have a combat card, and ideally these are sort of symbolized by what weapons you have available to you, so sort of like crossbows versus swords, right? So if you have a bow, let's say your opponent has a sword, then that plus who your combatants are. So in this case, the gang leaders could be like, okay, this guy's like an accountant or something like that, not really great at fighting, so maybe a combat score of 2. The sword maybe has a combat score of 2 as well. The bow has a little bit extra, and it's on a, let's say, stronger fighter, so like a knight or something like that, right? And if that's the case, then clearly this guy would win. They have the better weapon, they have the better person, so they would win the combat there. And then whoever wins gains control over the space and can force the loser to retreat in any direction. I didn't want it to be so that they killed the opponent, because that would be too big of a swing. Like, if you lose too much, that would be really bad in a game that I'm thinking is probably going to be long lasting, especially because if you lose something you contribute, like you put a lot of effort into, that really sucks. But also, there's no reason for these weaker guys if they're objectively so much worse. Like, the only way you can do it is if you move them away. But if you're constantly retreating, it really, I don't think that would be that great of a gameplay experience, right? And as you might have noticed here, I'm paying more attention to gang leaders rather than the gangs themselves. Originally, I had an idea where, there's like, you have 3 different gang cards, and then they all fight each other in their own different ways. Like, oh, this guy goes here, does a special effect, stacks some debuffs or something. But the issue with that is that's a 2-player interaction in what should be a 4-player game. And even if you had other people, like they bet on the outcome or they helped support, it's really tough to make it interesting to watch. And even then, it's sort of a mini game inside of the actual game. It's like almost you're playing 2 different games at once, which isn't super the experience what I want. But it can work in some games, but I don't think that's generally something you want. Anyways, that's where I'm at with that. Now, final iteration where I'm at currently is on your turn, you will either gain a community worker, and then you will do an action. I haven't talked about the community at all. Shoot. Well, community workers are essentially ones in the center. You might recognize this from the inspirations video, but there are workers that are in the center and there are workers that are loyal to you. And actually, I come to this later, but essentially there are loyal workers that will come back to you after your project is completed, and then there are workers that will not, and they will just stay where and they'll go back to sort of the communal stash. And these are the communal workers. They work for the community. And then you will have a sort of horde of loyal workers who will always be by your side, and you'll be able to utilize them no matter what. So you'll want to maximize this, and you'll also want these, so you can do more, because these are a lot easier to get, communal workers, but the loyal workers will stay with you forever, which is really important. And you can even do some things where you assassinate loyal workers of other players, which I think would be a very interesting mechanic. Sorry, I'm sort of rambling here. Anyways, as for actions, still the same actions for the most part. A slight change, instead of gang leaders or gang members, I just decided to change them to cohorts. So that way you can have your accountants, your scribes, your knights, your different types of folks. You'll, instead of having these different gangs, you'll just have your cohorts be in battle with your weapon cards. You'll also, this one I think is really interesting. It's really, let me think about how to explain it. Okay, this is a real big one to explain. But gain 3 community workers and then choose another player to gain it as well. And choose other players to gain it as well. So originally I was thinking, okay, you gain 3 workers, And that's sort of boring. That's a weird thing to do on your turn. It's you just gain 3 workers past. That sucks. Well, you can make it interesting. Maybe you can give another person, or you're forced to give another person 3 players, 3 workers. Now you're like, okay, now you're making alliances. This move, sure, it gives you things, but it's not necessarily boring because you're working on making deals and alliances with other players. But the issue is, in a 4-player game, well, you might just support one other person and it's just a 2v2 essentially. Well, what if you give 2 workers to one player and 1 worker to another? This is sort of buck wild. So you gain 3, someone else gains 2, and one other person gains 1. That also means that someone is gaining 0. So you are actively making an enemy, and you're actively making someone sort of displeased, and you're sort of making someone else kind of pleased. This doesn't really, I don't think, would piss people off very much because they would just retaliate in the same manner. It would just be a 2v2, like I said before. But in this case, you're really pissing people off, which I think is hilarious. And you can't also take the coward route like I had before, where you gain 3, someone else gains 1, someone else gains 1, and someone else gains 1. So that's cowardly as hell. Like this, you were forced to make an enemy, which I think is hilarious. This extra action is sort of a cycle. You don't like a community card, you gain a new one. And then this last one here, you're able to make loyal workers into soldiers. So soldiers, I think the way that they'll work, like I said before, you have your gang leader, your cohort nowadays. You have your weapon, which is kept secret from your opponent. You don't know which weapon they're going to deploy. And then the last thing you have is your soldier count, where no matter where they are, your soldiers contribute to your total power. So the more soldiers someone has, the more scary they are, the more threatening they are. Even if you go for one of their weak cohorts, they might still have a lot of base power. Even if they're technologically weak, because you don't think you've seen them take any high-tech weaponry like guns, they still have, like a sword, that's 1, but they have 3 soldiers, that's crazy in high numbers, right? That's 5, which might be something you want to try and avoid, even though that's something that's really potentially winnable if they didn't have the soldiers, which I think is interesting. Now, like I said before, your loyal workers come back to you, so they're a really valuable resource. By turning them into soldiers, they no longer work for you. Instead, they solely contribute to your battles. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic. Do you want to contribute more to military? Do you want to contribute more to working on sort of economic side of things and the more community side of things? Now, slight difference in landfall. We're going to excuse me. We're going to this is the objective things. I explained it too early. Sorry. This is where the objectives came into play, like the sub-objectives. The other one didn't have that. Sorry. Sort of got them confused. Oh well, that's fine. But this is where those different sub-objectives might pop up. Again, they guide you in the right direction while incentivizing competition. This is where your 10 artifacts are shown. So this way you can do sort of a snake draft for those different artifacts that give you super powerful power-ups, passive powers. But they probably will have a cost of some sort. And, you might not even want them in some cases. So there's a lot of possibility with that. And I also want it to be so your city grows a bit more. So upon landfall, your population grows because more people are joining your city from the land and going to the sky. So you have more workers to play with as the game goes on. There's a bigger pool that you're able to either convert to loyal workers or to just work with. Generally, you'll be able to get communal workers a lot easier if someone's sort of choking up the pool and sandbagging their workers. There's now more workers to use, right? There's more things to do with that. Community projects, I've decided to just list out 3 different ways, 3 different ideas for projects. elections, whoever is the top contributor gets a cohort. So if you weren't the top contributor, sucks to be you. You don't get your cohort. You didn't support them well enough. I think that adds some variety. Again, I don't know if I want to keep top contributor, but it's such an it makes so much sense for top contributor to gain control of that cohort. Constructions, these are again pretty much unchanged. You just add tiles to the board, and again, top contributor would gain control of it, like with the cohort. And okay, let me go back to elections real quick. If you were to do another election of the same cohort, then you could steal someone else's cohort, which I think is interesting. And anyways, production, these ones are like special events, like hey, let's work together. We're going to do a gardening community project or something like that, where everyone just pitches in to do this one thing for this one day, like it's a special holiday or something like that. Yeah, and that's pretty much these 3 different types of community projects. Ooh, I know that's a lot again, but as you can see, there's still, even though that was a lot, 36 minutes of stuff. I don't even know if I covered everything well enough in depth. It might still not make much sense, especially with the way I explain things. But as you can see, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ideas here, and I think it's sort of shaping up. There are still a lot of holes in it, like what are the resources for, like maybe each project requires resources, like how they require workers, and you contribute them in the same way. But there's a lot of different things that sort of need clarifying, sort of need adjustments, and yeah, like this is definitely not the finished core of the game. Long from it. I just thought this would be a good place to stop and sort of show you where I'm at. So, if you want to contribute anything in the comments below, perhaps this is your take on something, or this is how this should work. Or if you have any questions about how this works. There are a few things that I haven't really explained well. For example, let me just go ahead and explain something that I've been sort of neglecting this whole time, and I just totally forgot about it, is how people are actually contributing their workers to these projects. So again, projects are going to sort of be like cards, and at least the way I have it envisioned is each person will have their own sort of quadrant. So this would be for the red player, this would be for the green player, this would be for the blue player, this would be for the yellow player, or something like that. And you would have the name here, like let's call it factory. So this is your project, is you're building the factory, and then we'll say build a factory here. This is the effect. Build factory. So, this would be, okay, you put the A construction token, there's your hex on the side, you put the A on, this is where the final factory hex will go once the construction is done. Once it has reached its worker limit, which would be like over here. Maybe there's some other resources, like I said before. But this is sort of what a card would look like. And then when you want to contribute something to the card, it would be some gems from Color Factory here. You would just go ahead and be like, okay, I'll contribute 2 workers. And then green will be like, you know what, I'll also contribute 2 workers. And you put it in your designated quadrant. And then once it's done, once the project has been completed, suppose this is a project of 5, so let's say yellow contributes 1. Then boom, you know exactly who contributed what. All of the workers can be sort of the same thing. Again, I want there to be community workers, so they can't be colored to a specific player because they don't belong to a specific player. Of course, the idea with the loyal workers could be, these could be your community workers, these white ones here, and then this yellow one, blue one, and red one can be your sort of loyal workers. but you still need to know who contributed the most. So you would still need something like this. So red would contribute, one communal worker and one of their own workers, and or one of their loyal workers. Yellow might just contribute their one worker and their one loyal worker, and then green might contribute their communal workers instead of any of their loyal ones. So again, there's a lot of, if you have any questions, I'm sure I can answer them. I don't know if I really explained everything well, but like, for example, this one offshoot is something that's really worth considering. But hopefully I covered most of the different edge cases, and hopefully this video was enjoyable. Sorry, I'm kind of tired, but yeah, that's pretty much it thus far. Thanks for watching. If you have, again, any questions, any suggestions or anything like that, I'm really open to it. And again, I want to clarify this really is not the final product. Like, this is good progress, but this probably isn't even a quarter of the way through. So yeah, hopefully this was interesting. Thanks for watching. See ya.